It may seem absurd that 100,000 Māori would cede sovereignty to a small group of people, but that is not to give those Māori some credit. They actually realised that they were dealing with the representatives of the only global superpower. It's preposterous that Queen Victoria, who was in charge of that superpower, arguably the most powerful woman in the world at the time, would enter into a partnership with 100,000 Māori on the other side of the world. And actually, you also got to remember at that time, Māori had experienced the Musket Wars, so self-governance wasn't going that well. In fact, more people died in the Musket Wars than New Zealanders died in World War I overseas. We're now 180 years later in a society of all sorts of people with different backgrounds and challenges and choices, and the best thing that any country can do to overcome its problems is allow people that equal right, that equal chance to flourish in their own way. Then we can get stuck into the things I'm really worried about that affect Māori people disproportionately. That is, how do we build more warm, dry, healthy homes? How do we get more people to school with a decent education? These are how do we get high-paying jobs? The treaty has gone off beam. The way that it's been interpreted by a relatively small group of people is inconsistent with universal human rights and the things that allow countries to flourish by letting each person flourish, no matter what their background is or who their ancestors were. We need to solve that problem by providing an interpretation of those treaty principles. After 50 years of silence, since 1975 when it passed the Treaty of Waitangi Act, our Parliament should speak again. It should speak for the people who want equal rights and say our treaty is our founding document. It did create the ability for the government to govern. If you can find an example where people are categorised by who their ancestors were or their ethnic background, and they have a role to play in society and a role to play in politics based on race, and that's been a success, I'd love you to point me to it, because I can point you to many examples where things like that have been tried and they've been a failure. In fact, most of the good people in history have worked towards equal rights, universal humanity. That is actually what New Zealand is based on and what we've signed up to in various international treaties for that matter. If your idea is that actually somehow you're going to have a separate health authority, you're going to have different voting rights, that you're going to be appointed to government panels, all based on who your ancestors were, I'm sorry, it's not worked anywhere. We have had democracy of the likes that almost no other country can dream of. There's only 7 countries that have been democratic for as long as us. There are people all over the world who wish they had a government that was democratically elected the way that New Zealand is. That is the true legitimacy of Parliament today. That is the true legitimacy of the government today. People all over the world wish that they had that, and yet there are some people who want to look back 180 years into history and somehow run away from it. We have people who can all point to grievances and things that have happened badly in the past. We have people that came to escape the Scottish clearances, Irish famines, living in Dickensian England. We have people who have come more recently to escape all sorts of regimes. We have refugees. I represent an electorate that still has people who actually survived the Holocaust. I mean, there is no shortage of people that can point to things in the past. The question is, how do you make a society flourish? How do you create a society where people are able to flourish? And I would argue that this Treaty Principles Bill, by saying, look, the government has the right to govern, it's actually reflected in a treaty principle. So if your concern is that the legitimacy of the Parliament comes from the treaty, this does that. It says that people have a right to pursue their goals and own their things and pursue their language and culture and whatever other dreams they have within a legal framework provided by this government. This bill does that. Over the past 50 years, since Parliament said that there was such thing as treaty principles, and that's how we should view it, that's the lens through which we should see the treaty from the present day, Parliament forgot to do something. It forgot to say what those principles actually are, and into that void has rushed jurists from the courts, the Waitangi Tribunal, whose job it is to define the principles but doesn't want to have this bill, despite not having done it themselves for 50 years. You've seen the public service, you've seen the academics, you've seen a relatively small group of New Zealanders have come up with an idea of what Parliament meant by the principles. And the problem is that definition says that there's a partnership, a partnership between races. That means that we are seen primarily as a race rather than as human beings with equal rights in this country. And the result of that is that all sorts of other things that we need to be able to solve, like how do we build more houses for the next generation? How do we consent and build and fund the infrastructure to connect those houses together and connect them to jobs and opportunity? Come to that. How do we grow the economy? How do we ensure that people get along to school and get an education? Has been distracted and sidelined by this constant obsession with division under the so-called principles of the treaty. They've said that it's a partnership between races and therefore there had to be a separate Māori health authority. Three Waters had to be co-governed. That if you have a public department, there might be a Māori CEO and a non-Māori CEO. That you can have infrastructure projects held up by the need to consult local iwi, and on it goes. So many of the problems that we need to solve together, we actually can't do because of this divisive interpretation of the treaty that Parliament left open to a small group of people to have a say that is different from how most New Zealanders would like to live and believe. The Treaty Principles Bill is the solution to that problem. It says that the treaty means what it says and says what it means. Government has the right to govern, everyone has their basic rights protected, and everyone has the same rights and duties. And I think if Parliament was to finally answer the question it posed 50 years ago with the Treaty of Waitangi Act, that there are principles without saying what they are, then I think we could actually go forward together and solve so many of the other challenges that we face. What use is a constitutional framework if it doesn't allow people to overcome their problems and solve their dreams, no matter what their background is, who their ancestors were? All people can point to problems in their past, but what we need to do is ensure that each of us have the ability to flourish in our own way. Only when we do that, with freedom under the law and equal rights for all, will we be able to get on with flourishing as a country.